Let's talk about employment laws. So, what is a law? A law is simply something that has been written down as a rule that we have to follow as a company. And when we're talking about an employment law, it's a rule that we have to follow as a company that has the subject or topic of employment, something to do with the relationship between the company and the employees that work there, how they work, and so forth and so on. So, you've heard me say many times there are over 1.5 million employment laws in the US. Most people don't realize that the vast majority of those laws are federal. So, in the US, in the United States, the way that employment laws work is as follows. There are federal laws that got written years and years and years ago, way back in the early 1900s, before states were as active as they are today in this subject of employment law. And these rules or laws were created really in an effort to protect employers, companies, as well as to protect employees, the people that work there. And they just kept getting added. And over time, they kept growing and growing and growing in terms of the volume of laws. And today, the vast majority of employment laws are federal, and they do apply to every company that operates inside the US. No matter where you're located, they apply to those companies. There are some exceptions to what I'm saying. There may be some rules where those laws apply to a company based on its size or by its industry, so forth and so on. But if you just imagine, like over here on these shelves behind me, you have these laws, right? So if we pretend that these laws, some of these books up here are federal, those books would be the books that we would open up and we would read to understand what those rules say about what we need to do, no matter where we are. So now, beyond the federal laws, there are also state laws or state rules. And those state laws and rules also would apply if we're doing business in that state or we have employees in that state. And those state laws, interestingly, they're allowed to be used or passed or created so long as they're not less strict than the federal laws. So let me explain. Let's pretend that there's a federal law. There is not a law that says this, but let's pretend that there's a federal law that says that everybody at work has to wear clothing. There's not allowed to be a state law that conflicts with that. You can't have a California or Florida or Texas law that says, oh, you can ignore that federal law, come naked to work, right? You are allowed to make the law more strict. So, for example, there could be a federal law that says you have to wear clothing. You could have a state law that says, well, in addition to wearing clothing, we want the clothing to be purple. So it still follows the federal law. You have to wear clothing, but now there's a new state law that makes it more specific or restrictive, right? And the laws, the rules I just made up, the clothes and the color of the clothes, those are just made up laws, right? But it illustrates the point, and that's that as a state government and sometimes local governments, you can make the laws more strict. You just can't make them less strict. And that's a really important thing to remember. And the reason I say that is that in almost all cases, the federal law sits there, of which there are a lot of federal laws, over 800,000 unique federal laws. It's actually way more than that, but I'll just say over 800,000 just for context or background. And there might be 15, 20, 30, 50,000 state laws that come in and say, okay, those federal laws are great, but we actually want to make things a little stricter in our state. We want to change the rules a bit to fit the needs of what we're trying to do with companies and employees in the state that we're running. So when you think of employment law, first thing to think about is that there's a big giant bucket of federal law, and that applies to everybody. And then if the state laws are created, some of those state laws may just mirror or copy the federal laws, which basically says they're restating the federal law, which means that the federal law is there. It says that you've got to wear clothes, for example, and the state law says, yeah, you got to wear clothes. And there's really no conflict or no difference between the two. But many state laws do make those federal laws stricter, right? So that, again, in that example, color of clothing, or maybe, yes, you have to wear clothes, but you can only wear shorts, or you have to wear suits or something. Again, trying to use silly examples that don't create confusion about the laws that are actually out there. So that's the way that the laws are structured at a super high level. You have federal, you have state, and you have local. The state laws can make the federal laws a little bit more strict, and the local laws can also make the state laws more strict so long as the state allows them to do that. And many states do, or at least some states do. Not all local governments decide to pass laws about employment stuff. They may just decide to kind of roll with what the state says. And in fact, in most cases, that's what happens in the US. Of course, there's those exceptions to what I just said. People that live in Chicago, Illinois, for example, or West Hollywood or New York City, there are specific cities and locations in the US that have decided to make the laws a little stricter based on those geographic locations. So that's the super, I guess, 50,000 foot view of law based on geography, and also how those rules kind of connect with one another, or in some cases overlap. There's a federal law. Federal law says, hey, we're not allowed to discriminate against anybody who's over the age of 40. There may be a state law that says, yes, that's absolutely correct. You cannot discriminate against anybody that's over the age of 40. And we're going to add to that list, you also can't discriminate against anybody named Sean. Obviously, that's not really a law, but I'm just going to use that as a silly example. So those state laws can add on to the federal law and make it a little bit stricter. And the federal government allows states to do that. In other words, in the federal laws, it says that state governments have the right and authority to do so. And in the state laws, they also, or exercise that right and or can do that thing. So as we look at federal, state, and local laws or rules that apply to employment as a topic, what we then get into are what are the types of laws? And this is really kind of like law school 101. So if you decided to go to law school, you would learn this. If you didn't go to law school, well, I guess you're welcome in advance. I'm going to save you a lot of time and money and just cover how the laws are structured, the types of rules that are created, and talk a little bit about who creates those rules, as well as like how they interact with one another. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to jump between employment law and other types of law because it might be a little easier to understand if I do that. So in the US, there's a body of law called constitutions. I'm going to skip that for right now because those are really, a constitution is a very, very high level guiding principle, overall very basic rules that have to be followed. Every state has a constitution. The federal government has a constitution. We've all heard about the Constitution. We've heard about constitutional law cases. The laws that are written in that type of document are not specific like what we're about to talk about. They don't get into things like, hey, here's what you need to do when you hire somebody or when you fire somebody. They're super high level. They cover basic rights or basic ideas, things like you've got the right to free speech, right? You've got the right to bear arms, and you've heard these constitutional things in the news, what have you. So I'm covering that more as just for purposes of completeness because it is a type of law. They're very basic, high-level rules that are very important. And I guess the reason that that's really important is that the Constitution is like the top law of any particular location or area. So like the federal Constitution is like the law of the land, right? The entire United States. Any state constitution is the law of the state, and you can't conflict with that. It's at the top, right? It's truly like right up there at the top. Right below that are the laws that we spend most of our time with. And those are the laws that are created by the people we vote into office. And just as a sort of a discussion point, the reason those laws are valued so greatly and the reason that they're given so much respect is that they're created by people that each of us vote into office. Now, you may or may not have voted for the person that's your governor, or you may or may not have voted for the person that's actually in the government right now, but that person was voted into office by the people that live in the state, and they won the election, and they're now in the Senate, House of Representatives, governor's office, right, at a state level, at a federal level, the Senate, the House of Representatives, or the president. And these people that were voted into office, they create law. And when they create laws, because they were voted into office, the point of view or the idea is that these rules that they create represent our opinion. They represent our voice because we voted them into office. Hey, we all decided that Mary should be in charge of the state of Texas, right? Mary goes to create a law. In theory, Mary's law represents all of our collective agreement because we put all of our faith in Mary. We said, Mary, you're going to be in charge of Texas. Mary then goes and gets the law passed. And everybody that voted her into office obviously supports her ideas, or you get the ideas. And so those laws, because they're created by people we vote into office, are given a very, very high amount of respect. And we'll get a little bit into that later when we talk about court cases in courts. But those laws are called statutes or codes. I don't recall the origin of statutes in terms of why that word is used, and I'll probably recover this later. But codes are really it codifies or puts in a organized group of information to codify something. These laws and those codes that are published either digitally or physically, those codes represent the laws or rules that are created by the people we vote into office. And that's sort of right below the Constitution. The Constitution's up at the top. The codes are right below that. And again, they get created by people we vote into office. There's not really as many of those as you might think. There are a lot of laws for sure. But creating a law that's passed by the Senate, the House of Representatives, collectively, those two groups together are referred to as the Congress, whether that's state Congress or federal Congress. It's not often that those get passed, meaning that there's not a huge volume of those that get created each year in terms of new laws. There's a lot of like edits and changes that can take place, but the frequency of the creation of those laws is lower than some of the other buckets of law, which we'll talk about. So you have the Constitution, you've got the codes that are created by the people we vote into office, and then there's the next area of law, and this is really where a lot of activity takes place. And this bucket is called agency guidance or regulations. To regulate is to basically manage the rules and make sure that they're applied and enforced. And this is really where you and I, as people that live in a particular state or live in the United States, this is where we live, meaning that those agencies, which are created by the people we vote into office, and an example of that would be like the Department of Motor Vehicles. And I think that's a really easy example because most of us, at least of a certain age, probably have a driver's license, or we've interacted with the Department of Motor Vehicles, whether that's to get a driver's license or license plate or whatever it is. And that's an agency of the state government. So the state government, the people we vote into office, they don't have the time or resources to sit at the counter and take photos of us, or sit down with us and make sure that we pass our driver's license test. So what they've done is they've created laws that allow them to hire people to enforce or make sure these laws get followed. And those groups of people that do that, those are agencies. An agent is simply somebody who is authorized or allowed to act on behalf of somebody else. Sort of a logical word to be used. It's kind of a complicated word. Most people don't know it, but it simply means that the Department of Motor Vehicles, which is the department that makes sure that people follow all the driving rules in the state, they've been authorized by the people we voted into office to create rules and to run the whole show, right? So they create lots of rules. Those rules are based on the laws that are the codes. In other words, those codes that are passed by the people that are voted into office. Agency is allowed to create regulations, which more often than not, they'll take a code and they'll read it, and then they'll find a way to make it a little bit easier to understand for you and I to be able to understand what that means. And they may even go beyond that. They may create publications or guidance that they put on their website, or posters or other rules that they share with us that we can follow, that are the end result of that agency reading the code and finding a way to kind of simplify that language in a way that in theory everybody can understand. We could debate how simple regulations are to read or some of the publications are to read, but I think for the most part they do a really good job at making it easier to understand. Constitution's at the top, code right below, regulations below that. And then sort of next to the regulations, we could put a long list of things that those agencies can actually publish. Those agencies sometimes receive letters from the public asking them to give an opinion about how to apply a law. And those also get published. And those might be called opinion letters or rulings, where the agency is asked, hey, with these facts and circumstances in this law, tell us what's the right answer. Not a court case, but similar because there's a set of facts that are being applied to the law and a government agency is giving you their opinion as to how they would rule on that if asked, which of course they're being asked, right? So that's that third bucket, which is the agency guidance, which again includes regulations, published opinions, website information, and all those are also rules or laws that have to be followed. It's not optional to ignore what the agency says. They've been given permission by the people we voted into office to create these rules and to make sure that they're enforced. So now we get to the last bucket, and that bucket is courts. And they kind of sit adjacent to the published laws I just described, because it's the court's job to read and apply the law when there's a disagreement. In other words, nobody can agree on what to do with this law. And we're going to debate it. And we need a impartial group of people that will look at the law, that will look at the facts and circumstances. They'll apply those facts to the law, and then they will publish what's called an opinion. It's a court case opinion. And that opinion is also a rule or a law, meaning that how the court ruled is something that can be used in the future by other people to say, hey, I read this court case and it said that anybody that's wearing purple at work is following the law. I decided to wear purple. Later, I get sued by somebody or somebody says, no, that's not right. I could say, hey, well, there's a court case right here that says it is. So it really does have a value in that it applies the law based on a set of facts and circumstances, and it can be used and or looked at as guidance for what to do, assuming that your facts really match what was in the court case, right? Now, over in that courts area, there's usually three levels of courts. There's the court cases that take place all over the place, right? That could be your local courthouse. It could be a county courthouse. And that's what's referred to as the lower courts, or sometimes it's called that. In the federal area of law, that's the district courts. But in any event, it's kind of the lower level courts. It's the courts that hear all the stuff. And their decisions are really valuable and they provide a lot of great information. But it's once you kind of get up to the next couple levels that the court cases are really looked at as like guidance. So the next level above that is the appeal courts, and that's a court that listens to an appeal. So if you go to court, your business goes to court, there's a decision, and one of the two people don't like the outcome, they can appeal. They can say, hey, I don't feel like this went the way I wanted it to go, which you have to do specific things to appeal. But at a high level, you don't like the outcome, you find a way to get the appeals court to agree to look at it. Now, they don't always look at every one of those appeals. They may look at the person that comes to them and say, hey, listen, they got it right, there's nothing to look at. Or they may decide to pick that case up and say, okay, I'm going to review this. We're going to take a fresh look at it. Maybe something wasn't done right. And those appeal courts, just like the lower courts, they also issue opinions. And those opinions, again, are used as guidance for people to understand how to apply a set of facts to the law. And then Every so often, not nearly as often as you may think in looking at the news, those appeal court cases actually go all the way to the Supreme Court of the state or at a federal level. And that's where the highest court or the Supreme Court, it's usually called the Supreme Court. I think New York may call that the district court, but in any event, we'll forget all the different names that get used around the country at a super high level: Supreme Court, appeals court, lower courts. That Supreme Court will look at those cases, and they can sometimes decide to rule on that and or make sure that the facts and circumstances or the law was followed correctly. And when they're done writing that opinion, again, those are also laws that get stored. There's a lot of case law. In fact, the books behind me are actually case law books. They contain cases that were case opinions that were published and people can read in order to understand how the law was applied to a set of facts and circumstances. So when we're looking at employment laws, we have codes, we have regulations, we have, in addition to the regulations that are created by those agencies, whether that's Department of Labor or whatever the name of the department is in your state, or at a federal level, we also have all of the agency guidance, which can be in the form of opinions, rulings, administrative guidance, notices, posters, things that are posted on their website. And then next to all of that, there are also the court cases that are created by employees or employers going to court and having a court case, right, about something. That at a super high level is the structure of law in the US. And those laws I just mentioned, the codes, the regulations, the agency guidance, the court cases, those exist in every single state. And there's separate sets of those in every single state. And there's also a completely separate set of those laws that exist at a federal level. And again, I think I mentioned this at the outset, there are way more federal laws in the area of employment law than there are in any individual state, though some states do have a surprisingly large number of employment laws, especially when you start to get into the court case bucket. There's a lot of court cases on employment law. Some people may ask, well, how valuable are court cases when looking at employment law? And the short answer is extremely valuable. The reason that the court cases are so valuable is that what they do is they tell us as business owners, or they tell us as HR professionals, how things are going to go if there's a conflict. And it allows us to look at a set of facts and circumstances that have already been presented to a court in our state or at a federal level. And it lets us look at how the court applied the law. It lets us look at what are the things that influenced the court to either rule in favor of the business, the employer, or what are those things that influenced the court to rule in favor of the employee. And you've heard me talk about some of these specific cases before. You've heard me talk about situations where a court comes in and looks at an employee handbook and it's way too complicated to understand and it's buried within 70 or 80 pages. And there's no reasonable way that an employee can be expected to have actually read that, especially when there's just a single signature page. And when I talk about those circumstances, what I'm talking about are court cases. I'm talking about situations where there's two people. There's the employee and there's the employer, or two groups. And they've gone to a judge and they've said, hey, the employee says, this isn't fair. This thing happened. The employer says, it was totally fair. It didn't happen. And then the court comes in and looks at all the facts and circumstances. And when we see patterns in court cases, when we see patterns like a court looking at things like whether or not the employee handbook was acknowledged once at the end of the handbook, or whether or not the policies were easy to read. These are all indications of how the future might look if you were to end up in court. And the reason that we at HR Law Made Easy spend so much time poring over agency guidance, opinions, and court cases is because it lets us inform people that are using our platform of those types of situations that could get them in trouble. In some cases, it's not required. It's not required to have somebody watch a handbook presentation. There's no law that requires that. But we know that if we have a handbook presentation and an employee goes through each and every policy and they have to watch a video in order to progress on to the next step. And we've captured the date and the time that they watched that video, and we can prove that they, at least verify that they clicked the video and made it through, right? It's a much better protection for companies that end up in court. It means that when that judge comes and looks at the policies, or they look at the handbook and they see that there's been a digital presentation that's date time stamped, it's one more thing that you as an employer don't have to worry about. It's one more thing that isn't going to get you when you're in court. So that's just one example of why court cases are so valuable in reviewing and understanding, in creating a platform that helps companies get HR compliant, and really beyond that, protects companies and minimizes risk. So hopefully that overview of laws was helpful. Again, I want to do a video where I outline all of this information on a whiteboard and you can see that. But I was asked to go over this, so I wanted to just take a moment over the weekend and just kind of go through this stuff and get it out there. Take care.